Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now beginning our fourth season, and we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, heart issues, and more, plus the economy. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on the politics of climate change and how it affects our economic future. Now, the success of the recently enacted climate change legislation shows how the politics of climate change have shifted profoundly since way back when scientists began warning us about how human-caused emissions would warm the planet. Whereas President Jimmy Carter, back in the day, once pushed clean energy as a matter of personal, moral responsibility, the new bill just enacted treats climate change as a pragmatic, practical, pocketbook matter of consumer rebates and corporate tax incentives. Now, whereas also climate change once seemed distant, it is now a constant and persistent presence in shaping weather patterns, the economy, and daily life in much of the world, especially during the harsh summer months. Above all, backers of the recently enacted 730-page legislation, which has been called the Inflation Reduction Act, which also really the bill deals very little with inflation. But the backers say it is overdue and that coming decades after leading climatologist James Hansen testified in Congress and rang the alarm bell over global warming, it's been a long time. And now, with world leaders preparing to hold their next major climate summit in Egypt in November, that would be COP27, developing countries of the world are looking to the U.S. for leadership, even while at the same time criticizing us for the greenhouse gases that we've emitted over the last century. Now, a recent report that was conducted in April and May of this year, which sampled a representative sample of the U.S. population, and it was done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, along with the George Mason University Program on Climate Change Communication. And they were looking at how registered voters view our climate and energy policies. And keeping in mind all of this was done during that period of April and May of 2022, it was done prior to a number of very important political happenings, such as overturning of Roe versus Wade, overturning of New York's regulation about concealed carry of firearms, before a number of mass shootings, and before the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol and in its aftermath and finding out what went on there, and before the rule limiting the EPA's authority to set greenhouse gas emission standards for existing power plants, and of course during an enduring period of high inflation. But the survey found some interesting things. They looked at global warming as a voting issue, and they found that about 4 in 10 registered voters, or about 40%, say that a candidate's position on global warming will be very important when they decide who they will vote for in the upcoming congressional elections. They found that of 29 issues that the sample was asked about, registered voters indicated that global warming is the 24th most highly ranked voting issue. They found that when asked to choose their most important voting issue, that only 4% of registered voters chose global warming, making it the 10th highest ranked most important issue, again, near the bottom there. They found that a majority of registered voters, that is 58%, would indeed prefer to vote for a candidate who supports action on global warming, while only 17% would prefer to vote for a candidate who opposes any action on global warming. Now, looking at global warming and clean energy as government policies, the survey report found that 50% of registered voters say that global warming should be a high or very high priority for the president and for Congress. And they found that 61% of registered voters say that developing sources of clean energy should be a high or very high priority for the president and Congress. Now, looking at support for policies that reduce pollution that's causing our global warming, about 87% found that they support providing tax incentives or rebates to homeowners and landlords and businesses to make our existing buildings more energy efficient. 79% support funding for research into renewable energy sources, and 77% support providing tax rebates to people who purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels. They also found that 66% support requiring that fossil fuel companies should pay a tax on the carbon pollution that they produce, and then using that revenue to reduce other taxes, such as our federal income tax. And they found that 63% support requiring electric utility companies to produce 100% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2035. Now, looking at energy production, the survey found that 81% of those surveyed support generating renewable energy on public land in the United States, and that 58% support expanding offshore drilling for oil and natural gases off the U.S. coast. Then they turned to conservation and restoration policies, and they found that 86% support providing funding to help farmers improve practices in order to protect and restore the soil so that that soil absorbs and stores more carbon. They found that 80% support creating a jobs program to hire unemployed oil and gas workers to close down abandoned wells, and that 80% support creating a jobs program to hire unemployed coal workers to close down those old abandoned coal plants. Now, looking at whether or not we should declare climate change a national emergency, 58% support a U.S. president's declaring global warming indeed as a national emergency if Congress does not act. Now, looking at energy production as an economic issue, which is what we're going to talk more about today, they found that 52% say that policies to promote clean energy will improve economic growth and create jobs, while 30% say these policies will reduce growth and cost jobs. They also found that 57% say that increasing the production of clean energy in the U.S. will indeed promote or produce more new jobs than will increasing fossil fuel production, which is, to me, a very interesting finding. Now, looking at who should act, 68% say that corporations and industry should be doing more to address global warming, and about half or more also say that the following should do more to address global warming. Citizens say 61%, the Republican Party say 58%, the U.S. Congress say 57%. Now, in looking at issues of trust, blame, and grievance, the survey found that about 7 in 10 registered voters trust NASA, that's 74%, 74% trust family and friends, 71% trust scientists, and 69% trust their primary doctor as sources of information about global warming. And that indeed is interesting. Registered voters most blame global warming on others, like developing countries, 68%. 66% blame global warming on fossil fuel companies, and 65% blame it on industrialized countries, and 63% blame it on fossil fuel company CEOs, and 62% blame it on lobbyists. Now, 43% of people say that people like them will be unfairly harmed if the U.S. government does not take action to reduce global warming. Now, this survey, as well as a recent survey by the Pew Institute done around the same time, was also broken down by political party and ideology. And we're not going to go into that. We don't have time, and that's really won't get us where we want to go today. But people are exhausted by the pandemic. They're terribly disillusioned by the government, say the folks over at Greenpeace, which is the environmental group known for its guerrilla tactics, but also struggling at the time to mobilize supporters. The director of their campaign say, people see climate as a tomorrow problem, and we have to make them see that it's not a tomorrow problem, it's a now problem. Now, this is a lot. And today we've got three really smart people who are going to help us open this up and try to dig deeper into this and understand it some more in terms of the politics of climate change. And we're talking about not only the legislative side of politics, but the politics as it relates to those people groups who made things happen. So we're going to be right back on the other side of the break and introduce you to our expert guest and again, get into all of this. Right now, we want to give a shout out to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in most Whole Food markets, natural grocers, Central Markets, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, based on the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies established the parameters of human health and determined the optimum characteristics of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense foods to the modern diet. It connects local farms with health-conscious consumers. And their annual conference for 2022 called Wise Traditions. It's coming up soon. And here, there are nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstration, exhibits, impressive speakers, as well as delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. That conference is coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 23rd. For more information, visit wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the politics of climate change and how it affects our economic future. And we've got three experts that we're real excited to introduce and really unpack this. With us today, we have Barry Rabe. Barry is the J. Ira and Nikki Harris Family Professor of Public Policy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Barry is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration. Barry is a political scientist who examines the political feasibility of adopting and implementing policies to assist in climate change and environmental protection, and he is author and co-author of 6 books. Welcome, Barry. Did I get all of that right?
Just fine. Thanks, Brittany. Thanks for inviting me to the program.
And thank you for making time to be with us. Our other guest is Dana Nuccitelli. Dana is research coordinator for the nonprofit Citizens Climate Lobby. He is an environmental scientist, writer, and author of Climatology versus Pseudoscience, which is published in 2015. And Dana has published 10 peer-reviewed studies relating to climate change. And he's also published several climate-related studies, most notably on the 97% expert consensus among climate scientists that humans indeed are primarily responsible for observed global warming since 1950. Thank you, Dana, and welcome back. Dana was with us a couple of weeks ago, and we had to cut everything short. So did I get all of that right again, Dana?
You did. Thanks, Teresa. Happy to be back.
And again, thank you for making time for us. And back with us from last year is Jonathan Harris. Dr. Harris is a visiting scholar at the Tufts University Global Development and Environmental Institute, and he's a senior research fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center Economic in Context Initiative. Jonathan's research concerns the economic and environmental impacts of climate change and the policy responses needed to stabilize the planetary climate. Jonathan is past president of the U.S. Society for Ecological Economics, and he's a recipient of the Herman Daly Award for visionary contributions to the field of ecological economics. Welcome, Jonathan, and did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did.
Thank you guys again for making time to join us and help us unpack this. Now I want to start off with Barry. Barry, one definition of politics is the set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations among individuals, such as the distribution of resources or status. And I put that out there to kind of set the stage that politics is not all just about what happens with the legislators in Washington. You know, it's similar to office politics and things like that. So given that, I want to talk first about the politics of climate change in terms of who is driving the decisions about what climate change is or how we define it and how we know it when we see it.
Sure. Great question. You know, and you're right. Politics is ubiquitous. Certainly in a nation like the United States, it cuts across every level of government, every institution of government, but then filters into questions of any number of private, organizational, institutional decisions. And you add all of that up, and you begin to look at things like fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas impacts. I think it's important to begin with that understanding that everyone is involved in this, and yet we know historically, at least recent history, that certain players are going to be much more likely to come to the table. Those that are directly associated with the production and use of fossil fuels could be threatened by any transition away from those products. Each entity, each group has its own take and play, and in some cases those will collide, as we've seen in a number of Congresses, in a number of state legislative processes. So again, this notion that power is distributed pretty broadly in a society like ours, that means that there are lots of players, but some that will be particularly influential, both in encouraging and promoting climate-friendly solutions, and those who might be threatened by it and work to thwart those initiatives.
Who or what do you see that's driving the urgency of climate change mitigation right now? While, as we established in all of those statistics I read at the beginning, it's still not as urgent as it needs to be or must be, but we're all seeing a growing urgency. So who or what's driving that?
Sure. You know, some of those poll findings that you shared at the outset of the show are interesting to think about over time, both the Yale survey that you were citing and others, because we're clearly seeing shifts in the U.S. and around the world whereby people see climate change not as just some long-term, out-in-the-future question, but one with which they can begin to see immediate issues, challenges, and threats. And so those numbers tend to be going up over time. That reflects the fact that we've dawdled on this issue in the U.S. and globally. The concerns about greenhouse gas impacts on climate were not newly created just a few years ago. They've played out over many, many decades, and there have been abundant opportunities to act more decisively through political systems on these issues. We've had some really significant successes in the U.S. and globally on this, but not nearly enough. And because of those lags and because of those delays kind of kicking the problem down the road, it becomes bigger and bigger, especially as we begin to see real impacts closer to home. I think that's become a big factor and a big driver for concerns, certainly throughout the U.S., but really around the world in different ways, depending upon how climate change might be manifest in those places.
Indeed, it's what we all tend to deal with. What's on the table now. Dana, I want to jump to you in terms of how does Citizens Climate Lobby currently view the politics of climate change, and who do you guys see as having the power as it relates to influence and moving the needle and marshaling resources? What do you see from your chair?
Yeah, I think one key from the political side and the policy side is bipartisan solutions are going to have more staying power than partisan policy solutions because, the control of government changes fairly frequently. And so if one party passes legislation on its own, then the other party gets control. They could potentially unravel it and undo it. And so we try to lobby members of Congress from both sides of the aisle to try to get as many bipartisan climate solutions as we can. So that's a key. And the way we do that is by empowering volunteers to, contact their members of Congress and, take various steps to try to influence the members of Congress thinking from both sides of the aisle so that we can get them moving in the right direction, supporting more and more of these climate policies.
But looking at it from the groups, that's what I'm going to look at in terms of who's got the power as it relates to influencing and moving the needle. The groups in terms of, not the folks in Washington, but citizens, scientists, fossil fuel folks, or what?
Sure. Certainly industry lobbyists have a lot of power, and we've been trying to increase the power of citizens and the members of Congress. That's their constituents, that's their voters, that's who ultimately puts them in power. And so we try to kind of counteract the influence that corporate lobbyists have with increasing the influence of citizen lobbyists and getting them to express their preferences that their members of Congress do something about climate change, so that their members of Congress are aware that those who are voting for them and putting them in power want them to take action on the issue.
Indeed. And I want to throw that question also to Barry, and then after that, we're going to talk about the economics of it. Barry, from where you sit in terms of the groups, what are you seeing? How's that developed over time? Because I think we all know at one point, the fossil fuel companies had the money, they were throwing it there, and of course they hired the lobbyist. What are you seeing now, and how are you seeing that change over time?
No question, in a nation like the United States, which leads the world annually in oil and natural gas production, with supply chains that run from production through refinement and use. Oil and gas and coal are legal to use in the U.S., are produced widely. They employ many, many people in a great many states, and many states, including Texas and other major oil and gas producing states, are heavily reliant or dependent upon that revenue through a range of taxes. That really does create a formidable coalition. It's not the only force or factor, but it's a very significant one. But I do think we are beginning to see the power of that industry beginning to splinter somewhat, certainly in recent congressional developments, and that becomes a big factor going forward.
And I want to go to Jonathan for just a minute. We've got about 2 minutes before we go to break. Talk to us, and you can start, we'll probably have to finish this on the other side, about what climate change is costing us economically, and how is it measured, and how is that cost distributed?
Well, it's always controversial to translate climate impacts into dollars. But a few simple things is just to look at the cost of disasters. If you look at Hurricane Ian recently, the estimates are still coming in, but are in the range of $100 billion in damages. And while it's controversial whether any particular hurricane or its intensity are the result of climate change, it seems clear that warming waters is, in fact, increasing the frequency and intensity of hurricanes. So you can put at least part of that down to climate change. If you want to say what that would be in terms of a per capita figure, just taking that $100 billion, that's about $300 per person in the U.S. If you look more at the affected area in Florida, it would be something like $10,000 per person. So even with the squishiness of estimates, so it's a significant amount in terms of dollar figures. Then if you look at something like the insurance industry, and particularly the reinsurance industry, who are the people who pay in the cases of really big disasters, they are highly concerned. Swiss Re, one of the world's biggest reinsurance industries, has estimated an ultimate loss of something like 11 to 15% of GDP as a result of climate change. Climate change is allowed to proceed.
Indeed. And on that, we'll stop and go to break. But I just want to say it seems to me, though, that the insurance industry should be the cheerleaders for doing something about climate change. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Barry Rabe, Dana Nuccitelli, and Jonathan Harris, who are making us smarter. Thank you all. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. To today's show on the politics of climate change and how it affects our economic future. We are back with Barry Rabe, who is from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Dana Nuccitelli with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and Jonathan Harris with Tufts University Global Development and Environmental Institute. Thank you all for being with us. Now, before the break, Jonathan, you were telling us or talking to us a little about the economics of climate change and how it's measured and the cost per person. And something that I want to dig into a little bit more that you said that perked my interest, and I mentioned it right before we went to break, and I will say it again, and that is based upon some numbers you just quoted with the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry and the numbers that they are seeing and experiencing. It seems to me that they ought to be the biggest cheerleaders in terms of climate change mitigation and global warming. So where are they with that, if anywhere?
They are very concerned. So that's a possible countervailing industry to the power of the fossil fuel industry that Barry was talking about. Another thing that interests me is the increasing renewables industry. Solar and wind are rapidly increasing. They have a strong interest in policies that favor renewables. And an interesting phenomenon that you sometimes see in so-called red states is support from the Congress people there for measures to give tax rebates or other support to the solar and wind industry. You know, Texas, one of the more conservative states in the country, has a huge wind industry and is probably going to expand significantly more. Iowa, interested in wind industry. We also have, a major potential offshore wind industry developing. They have that in Europe. We don't have it here, but it's just beginning. In Massachusetts, where I am, there's large offshore wind planned. So it's possible that you begin to see an economic tilt. Barry had mentioned employment in the fossil fuel industry, but employment in the renewables industry is growing very rapidly, has huge potential for the future. We have a huge need, for example, for electricians as we electrify and move more to renewable energy. So there's a lot of jobs, a lot of job training, a lot of potential political benefits there, which could be mobilized perhaps, as well as the fossil fuel industry mobilizes to defend their interests.
Indeed, because a lot of the rhetoric that I hear in favor of legislation, and even before the recent legislation got enacted, and a few years ago when they were talking about, the Green New Deal, I did hear rhetoric about jobs. That moving to mitigate climate change and going green is going to increase jobs. It didn't seem to stick a lot. It seems like to me there needs to be more specifics. Is anyone aware of anything like that where there are specific training programs? Are there specific numbers that say we can, of the X number of jobs that are being eliminated as a result of reduction or elimination of fossil fuels, X percentage can be retrained or can be rehired? Is there anything out there like that? Because I think that makes a difference to people.
Well, there's a lot of interest, I know, in the Appalachian area where you have, rapidly declining coal industry. And that is happening as an economic phenomenon pretty much regardless of policy. So there's a strong interest in retraining people and employing them in the renewables industry, in things like land reclamation. And it seems to me that the balance is going to begin to tilt. In the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, you have hundreds of billions of tax credits, subsidies, direct payments for development of renewable energy. The more that develops, the more people have their livelihoods associated with that. So the bigger a political lobby that should be. I draw an analogy to the Affordable Care Act. So when that first came in, it was quite unpopular. People believed the rhetoric about it, not just about death panels, but that it would be very expensive, that the government would be in charge of your health care, that health care costs would go up, that doctors wouldn't be able to prescribe what they want, all kinds of horror stories. Once the ACA got in place, it became quite popular, and the efforts to do away with it have been unsuccessful. I see something similar happening with the renewables industry. That at first the fossil fuel industry says, we're very dependent on oil and coal. If we try to shift to renewables, costs will go way up. People will be paying higher energy bills. And this has a public impact. But as you see that in fact is not true, the shift to renewables, if anything, lowers energy bills. I think you're going to see a shift in public opinion. And I think that's already beginning.
I would think that the current energy companies ought to be some of the biggest investors in renewable energy. I remember when I first went to MBA school, in every class they would tell us, they said, well, you know why the railroad industry kind of went out of business or declined, rather? They said because they thought they were in the railroad industry. They failed to see they were in the transportation industry. And so taking that on to electric companies, they're in the energy industry. And it doesn't all have to be fossil fuel. It's like, just seems to me they should be the biggest builders of the wind farms and supporters. But I do know change is hard, especially when, it's perceived to hit the pocketbook. Let me ask you this, though, Jonathan. What segment of our economy is the biggest winner and the biggest loser because of climate change? How and why so?
Because obviously the major winners are everybody associated with the rapid expansion of renewables. In terms of losers from climate change, obviously it's anybody who's affected by any of these major disasters, the wildfires in the West, heat waves, flooding, hurricanes. People who are directly impacted by that may lose everything. People in Florida have lost everything. So, there are huge losses there. And then there are more distributed health losses. We're talking about personal health. Definitely, for example, allergy season has become significantly worse with climate change, and that will get worse further. So that affects many, many people. May be difficult to put a dollar figure on it, but there's a lot of medical costs, but it also significantly affects quality of life.
Indeed, but I have to think too, Jonathan, that the electric utility companies themselves are experiencing some heavy economic losses due to all these ravages. When you got wildfires, their lines are burning, they got all these kind of issues, the same thing with some of the other extreme weather events. Are there any statistics or dollar figures to attach to that?
Certainly, California PG&E is.
And Dana, I think you wanted to weigh in on that because they've got the wildfires, but it seems like every part of the country has their own set of issues,
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I'm in California, and my utility is PG&E, and because of the wildfires that they sparked, even though climate change has exacerbated the wildfires, they get blamed for sparking the wildfires in the first place and doing all the damages to cities like Paradise, for example, and being on the hook for billions of dollars in recovery costs. But it depends on the particular region that the utility is in, whether, there's wildfires or freezes affecting the power systems. Like in Texas, they've had issues with both heat and freezes in their local utilities. So it's a tricky thing. And there's also the question of the utilities having already built a bunch of fossil fuel infrastructure that they're in the process of paying for over the lifetime of, for example, a coal power plant. Maybe they'll have installed some pollution controls on the coal power plant smokestack that they're still having to pay over time. And if that coal power plant gets put out of business and replaced by clean energy, then they might have some costs that the utility is losing. And so they have kind of a vested interest in keeping the fossil fuel power plants going so that they don't lose those sunk costs. They're called stranded assets if they're not able to pay for the entire cost of the power plant over its lifetime. So there's a lot of tricky factors.
Indeed, but I have to think that they are being economically impacted at a significant level in the various areas of the country, depending on what their issues are. And then they pass it on to us, obviously. And then as citizens, we get dinged in two ways by the cost as well as looking at what's going on. We just got a couple of minutes to go before the break. And so I want to start this next question off with Barry. I want to talk about how the U.S. stacks up with other countries in terms of our acknowledgement of climate change and its effect, and in terms of our mitigation. So right before the break, just talk about how we stack up around the world with our acknowledgement of it. And then after the break, we'll come back and talk about how we stack up in terms of what we're doing.
So focusing on acknowledgement, Bernice, I would argue the U.S. record is very mixed. Ironically, if you look at the sciences, particularly in the United States that are relevant to understanding climate, the American contributions to our global scientific understanding of this is phenomenal and has been in place for some time. It is recognized around the world as a major, major contributor to our global understanding of how significant that this is. The irony comes into play when you look at public opinion, the deep divides on this issue in the United States, which are beginning to close. But the challenge for many Americans to acknowledge, again, using that framing, that this is a real issue or a real problem. We still see in many surveys 20 to 30% of Americans who argue that there is no evidence that global warming is occurring, much less getting into issues of human causation. So there's a kind of a two-part answer to that question. The scientific contribution and acknowledgement is huge. The American populace more generally, somewhat divided still.
That's interesting, too. And we'll come back and talk more about this on the other side of the break. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsors, Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation. Based on the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies establish the parameters of human health and determine the optimum characteristics of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense foods to the modern diet. Their annual conference, called Wise Traditions, is coming up. And there, nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstrations, exhibits, impressive speakers, and delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. It's coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 23rd. For more information, visit wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the politics of climate change and how it affects our economic future. And we are back with Barry Rabe with the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, and Dana Nuccitelli with Citizens Climate Lobby, and Jonathan Harris with Tufts University Global Development Environmental Institute. Welcome back. And again, thank you all for being with us. And you indeed are making us all smarter on what can be a very interesting but complex subject. So before the break, Barry was talking to us about how the U.S. stacks up with other countries around the world in terms of our acknowledgement of climate change and its effects. And interesting, you did say that we tend to be leaders in terms of the science, not so hot in terms of the acknowledgement. And so I want to talk to us a little bit then, Barry, about how we stack up with other countries in terms of mitigation and resources that are devoted to it.
Well, there are about 24 nations around the world that have actually reduced their greenhouse gas emissions annually since 2000. Most of those are members of the European Union, Germany, Finland, and the like. One is the United States. Unique to the Americas, North and South America, the United States has reduced its emissions. That reflects some significant developments in the area of renewable energy, which we've talked a bit about, some steps forward in terms of energy efficiency, and significant reductions in our reliance on coal for electricity. That's a mixture of state, federal policies and the like. The challenge, of course, for the U.S. has been sustaining these policies, particularly at the federal level, over any extended period of time. The U.S. is the nation that helped create the Paris Agreement. The nation is the first major world nation to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And we've had a kind of on, off again in many of our state policies and even receptivity to those issues. That has impacted our ability to really achieve sustained emission reductions. It also has limited or damaged our credibility internationally when we call upon other nations to step up, other nations asking, what exactly is it that you're prepared to do internally, or how far are you willing to go in terms of sharing your own resources and technologies with us? It's a very, very mixed record, although there are reasons to be hopeful given developments in the last year or two, or even the last month or two.
Indeed. Thank you for that. And Jonathan, what do you see as, and this is like just at this real pragmatic level that everybody is living through. What do you see is the intersection of climate change with many of our current economic issues today? You know, like the inflation, the cost of housing, all these supply chain issues, the immigration and nationalization, and the political divisiveness. Where might climate change be intersecting with some of all of this?
Well, there are multiple ways. The major concern now, of course, about inflation. A large chunk of that inflation is based on fossil fuel dependence. Everybody has to go out and buy gas unless they have an electric car or are taking a bike or public transit. They see the price of gas going up. In order to avoid that dependence, oil typically has a volatile pricing. We need to shift to renewables. If you do have an electric car, you're not that much affected by changes in the price of gas. There's also food inflation. The current food inflation mostly has to do with direct and indirect effects of the war in Ukraine. But climate change obviously affects agriculture. In countries that are heavily affected, like Pakistan, was severely flooded, their food supply, is completely wiped out by the effects of climate change. So there are, significant impacts on energy, significant impacts on food, and then significant impacts indirectly on health costs. More difficult to measure, but as I say, in a number of ways, climate change adversely affects health, allergies, heat impacts, spread of tropical and other diseases. So there's a lot of contribution to costs, even though people may not recognize that directly. And in some cases, it may be difficult even for economic researchers to identify all the connections, but there undoubtedly are significant costs.
Indeed, indeed. And I know it, like you said, it's difficult to measure a lot of these things. But as you know, like I know, you're an economist. I'm not, but I still know that money talks and people's pocketbooks move things. So, in my dream world, in my dream climate change mitigation world, if people could really see, say, for example, how much savings they would get or how much it's costing them, this fossil fuel dependency and climate change issues, it might move the needle really far. But again, I realize that's in my dream world. I want to move back for a minute and then talk about the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act, aka climate change legislation, and ask each one of you what you see perhaps as the most impactful in terms of two things, in terms of what you feel will be dollar savings and in terms of what can make the biggest difference quickest. And so I want to start with that with Dana, and then we'll go to Barry and then Jonathan.
So for individuals, there's some really good rebates and tax credits for things that we can do in our homes, like replacing fossil fuel space heaters and water heaters with electric heat pumps, which much more efficient and save on electric bills, and also tax credits for electric cars, which, as Jonathan was saying, they're much cheaper because you don't have to worry about paying for gasoline, with the cost of gasoline going up and down, lately mostly going up. So they're much cheaper to fuel. So for individuals, that's kind of the most impactful aspects of the legislation. And then overall, it's the tax credits for clean energy like wind and solar that are going to really expand the amount of wind farms and solar farms. They're expected to triple over the next 8 years as a result of these tax credits. Although there is one challenge that we also have to do permitting reform so that we can build transmission lines to connect the new wind and solar farms to cities where people need electricity.
Thank you, Dana. What's your take on that, Barry?
I think one of the things that has probably been less discussed than some of the very important credits that Dana was just talking about is in the area of methane. There are multiple gases that contribute to climate warming. One of them is CH4, not carbon dioxide, but CH4 methane, which comes in from multiple sectors, but particularly large-scale energy production. The U.S. has really pivoted over these last 2 years from being a global laggard on methane into much more of a leadership role, combining a set of policies that are complementary to one another, regulations that are being developed and will play out over a number of years, but a combination of subsidies, incentives, and payments to industry and to states to help them better manage and use state-of-the-art technology to capture and mitigate methane, as well as, for the first time in the U.S., adoption through legislation of a tax or fee on industry for doing climate damage, a methane fee, which is, to this point, has only been attempted in Norway, actually with great success there, as part of their strategy to minimize methane emissions from oil and gas production. So I think the methane fee is an interesting one, not only for the impact that it might have on methane, which has very intensive near-term impacts for a couple of decades in the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide, which lasts longer, but also beginning to look at a suite or a complementary set of policies as opposed to relying on just one tool. To do it, we probably are going to need more of these kinds of policy packages.
Yeah, I like that. And as you said, too, a lot of people it's not easily explained or understood. And I think for that reason, a lot of ordinary people in their everyday lives don't know about it. But I do think, because as I said earlier, and I know Jonathan respects it, that money talks. And by these big methane polluters getting charged fees, that will make a difference in terms of their action. Jonathan, I'm going to throw that question to you in terms of where do you see the greatest impact cost-wise, but also in terms of making the biggest impact in climate change mitigation?
Well, as Barry and Dana were saying, the subsidies to individuals, individual tax credits and so forth are very good for renewables and are also generally popular. What's less popular to people is anything that has the word tax involved. Possibly the methane tax, may not be so much of a concern to the public because they see that as going on the corporations. But of course, what the corporations will always do is they'll come back and say, oh, this is going to raise your energy bills. So the most difficult thing to get through is anything that is associated with the word tax. Easier is cap and trade. From an economic point of view, that has a similar effect. But for example, the California cap and trade program, immediate impacts come on industry. That creates also credits potentially for things like conservation of forests, agricultural practices that store carbon. So cap and trade may be politically more popular. And overall, in my mind, as I said earlier, the key thing is job creation, that if these programs create more jobs, that this is very politically popular and also creates a lasting constituency for maintaining those programs.
Indeed, and I like that. We have to push it more. We just have 1 minute to go. And I want to throw this to Barry really quick. And that is, what are some of the most encouraging developments in climate change politics and policy that are out there right now, Barry?
I'm going to go back to a word that Dana used earlier, bipartisanship. We tend to think it's an impossibility in climate policy, and yet alongside the IRA legislation that we've been discussing, the U.S. Senate, with bipartisan support, ratified a major climate treaty at about the same time, the Kigali Agreement, to achieve a global strategy for an 85% reduction in use for hydrofluorocarbons. These are chemicals that are commonly used in air conditioning and refrigeration systems around the world. They are a super intensive, short-lived climate pollutant. And the U.S. has already passed legislation to do this, has now played a major role in a treaty which has also been ratified by China and India, and is moving aggressively toward developing a mechanism so that the smuggling of these now being phased out chemicals is going to be constrained largely through leadership that's being taken by the U.S. Very rarely discussed, very rarely considered, but a reminder that it's not just a fossil fuel issue. There are often other industries, and to me, this is a very exciting development, even though we tend not to talk about it very much.
Indeed. I think, though, kind of like somebody said, though, the fossil fuels are ubiquitous, but these things were also, because all of us got a refrigerator, but it's not as immediately perhaps felt or seen or experienced. And I think that's one of the things that we have to get over in terms of moving forward faster with climate change is kind of what this Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio tries to do. And that is educate and inform people about what's going on as it relates to them, because that's what moves the needle. We really want to thank you all. We're at the end of our show, and as always, we don't have enough time to talk about this, but you all have made us smarter in terms of helping to unpack and dig deeper into what can be a complex subject, but it's all around us and affecting all of us every day in our health and our pocketbooks. So we've been today with Barry Rabe with the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Dana Nuccitelli with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and Jonathan Harris with Tufts University Global Development and Environment Institute. And we really appreciate you. Thank you for making time for us. And we look forward to having you back on our show at other times during the year, but certainly next year when we do climate change again in November. Thank you all very much. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and even in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening today, and listen in next week for more on climate change. Also, you can listen to any of our past shows on podcast wherever you get yours. Thank you.